Hello guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're back with more scary things, but as I told you last video, if you did not see my last video, go check it out. And today, as I said before, we're going to be doing some Mr. Ballen, and today we have the top 5 bingeable scary stories and that's Forrest Horror Edition. Let's get into this.
Today we have a really cool video for you guys. It'll be a collection of 4 stories that are all fan favorites, and they all share a theme.
This is going to be interesting.
These stories have all been totally re-edited, so even if you've seen them before, it's going to feel new and improved. That was the whole point of doing this. We wanted this to feel like a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to refill the like button's Keurig machine, but instead of using water, go ahead and take all the water from inside of those baggies that contain fresh mozzarella cheese and just dump that gross gray water in there. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Sleep well.
In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid
make it pretty superstitious
of mysterious death, it became these Superstitious Mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop, where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself.
And that's going to be his downfall.
On the day
probably
he was
going to be his
supposed
downfall.
to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night.
That's going to get even worse.
Bad idea to start
it's getting even worse
because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out, but he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. So
I probably want to continue if it's 5 in the morning. I'll just go back home and wait for another day, wait for my partner,
but he
if
wasn't
he's
able to move
gonna
as fast
come.
as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark, and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him.
Ooh,
and then at
that's
one point
bad.
he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen,
he would have died.
Really badly hurt. And he's 15
he probably wouldn't be able to get out
away from
either.
the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting
probably no service at all.
No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so
that's what I'd do if I actually continued.
There was a forest right nearby, and you could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the day.
Just because there's a fireplace there does not mean that they made it out just fine.
Sam intentionally did
just means that they actually stopped there.
Bring a tent. He liked to sleep on
the
sleeping bag, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And
that's a good idea.
Was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet. in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But
I'd be nervous.
Rationalizing this kind of bad gut
but I'd also
feeling,
be
a
suspicious.
rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock.
That's not good.
Immediately, he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited.
I need to start using my flashlight.
Sam is really
there he is.
Scanning the tree line.
He is doing the flashlight.
Listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything. He doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so
let's just hope there's no humans there, because I feel like
there's nothing wrong.
in these type of situations, humans could probably be a lot worse than an animal. Unless he doesn't have like any equipment for an animal, then they both could be equally bad. But humans probably worse since they have the intelligence to do things that animals wouldn't be able to do.
About that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way,
how would a rocket on the tree?
Totally explainable, and you got nothing to worry about.
How would a rocket on the tree in the first place?
He convinced himself, and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp, and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up, and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it.
Better hurry it up or it's going to get away at that point.
And he can't find his flashlight. He's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man,
it took its flashlight. It took his flashlight. It's that's a bad sign.
Going off in his head.
Yep,
the only
instantly.
way this flashlight moves is if
someone
moved it. And if it's not here,
or someone took it.
And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag.
Also that, technically.
The tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away. Which means someone or something had been
took his flashlight
away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation,
do not go for that flashlight.
So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife and
you make sure to stay vigilant.
His campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it.
Get more
he's not going to go anywhere near
visibility.
For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront what
at least he's got a knife.
Out in the woods.
At least he's got a knife.
Over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer. And when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close.
So they're just trying to just get as close as they can without being seen. That's what I'm guessing.
But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood. So unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out. And he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next. Because he knew that with that fire gone, he was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching. And before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them, and it's still dark outside. He's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind.
That has to be a human. I don't think an animal would do that, unless they're a very smart animal, like a wolf, maybe.
For 2 hours, this poor
2 hours?
is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees, Probably his imagination is going crazy.
Got a knife
with what could
in hand.
be behind those trees.
Gotta get ready.
Waiting for what
Stab.
happened next. But ultimately, the
Nothing
only thing
happened?
that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved. It turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. So when the sun finally did,
You should leave now.
Just charge out of there because he's
Better
still
leave.
thinking there could be a trap. He waited until
Wait for like an hour or two,
and then he packed up everything
till he can see everything around him.
Sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove.
Big brain move. Big brain move.
Until he got to a gas station.
Big brain move.
Park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car and he went in and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved the people that wrote this message?
Okay, it wasn't a real photo.
And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight?
No, you probably would not have lived through that night. I'm gonna tell you that right now. You probably would have got snatched, caught, and taken away. Dead.
In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't
Strange
that
noises
loud,
in a
but it
camping
sounded
area.
distinctly.
Strange noises in a camping area, especially if it's not a public camping area. It's terrifying. I'm gonna tell you that right now. If you ever go camping and you hear strange noises and you're not in a public camping area and you're probably the only person there, it's probably not the best idea to continue camping in that area.
Was digging in the ground, but she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent.
I'd always fear the worst.
There was moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent. And she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees. And she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up, and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, and she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent, and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door, and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend.
Really trying to dig for treasure in the campsite.
What's going on out there? He takes a flashlight, and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more, and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention, and she stops digging, and she stands.
It'd probably be better to just not get attention from someone that you do not know.
Up slowly, and she turns around and faces them, and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not.
Apparently we're watching a ghost video and Mr. Ballen now.
Not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when
she's going to come back with more people.
They open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights, and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here.
You can't get to tomorrow.
And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back.
Well, she's going to come back.
Back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep.
When you start hearing noises,
yep. Their campsite, and they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?"
Who do you think you are?
She gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal, and they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now, because
there is a way.
They were pretty aggressive with her this time, and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent.
She's probably very persistent.
They hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally
stay up all night on that area.
For when they went back in the tent. And
waiting exactly for the time you go back in the tent.
She's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad, and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, why are you yelling at me? And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are
like
totally
on 4
shaken
legs
up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just keeps coming back to their site, and they don't know what to do about it. So they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights, and they decide, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That
yeah,
way
I'd do the same thing.
Doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything.
Stay up all night.
About 3:30 in the morning.
Checking.
They've been outside for 2 hours. They're getting cold.
Better not sleep.
Tired. The woman's nowhere to be found.
She's gonna come running back as soon as you go in the tent.
Go back in and get some sleep. I think this time she's really gone. They get
I don't
back
think
in their
so.
sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and
everything's gone,
tent, they look outside,
or everything's
all
scattered.
Stuff has been thrown all over the campsite, and the hole in the ground that the woman had dug, that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep, is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And
of course she was. She's persistent.
Their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked
nothing's
around,
gone.
Nothing was missing. And there
yeah, it
was
was
some
just everywhere.
Stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened. But the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day, because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal.
Imagine if it was a ghost. Ghost. Must have been a ghost. I'd say a ghost.
In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles, where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals, silence. It's just totally
That's
silent.
weird.
The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here.
I bet you even if it's private property, no animals are going to care. There should be animals in that forest.
They finally made it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals, and all day long, they don't see a single animal, they don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, you know, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, you know, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite, and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed.
Huh.
Eben's father turns to him and says, "Oh, it must have been the wind." And Eben says, "No, it couldn't have been the wind. Because
Cannot
all
have
day
been the
today
wind.
we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening.
No wind, no animals.
It's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father
Animals,
was like, well,
no
when
animals.
you set the tent up, did you not put the posts
No
into
wind,
the eyelets?
no,
Did you not build it correctly?
humans.
And Eben's like, no, I've made
No
that
an-
tent
well, that's
1,000 times.
private
I know it
property.
was set up correctly. They
No wind, no animals, no weather. Nothing. There's nothing in this forest, which should be full of life and probably some wind. That's strange. I'd not be comfortable about being there.
walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent and they're really confused at what they see. The two rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon
gone.
loops and an anchor at 4 different points in the base of the tent.
What?
Well, they had been removed from the
Oh,
four
they are
corners.
removed.
And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just
Yeah,
pop
it's not
out.
just gonna
It's
pop out.
anchored at 2 sides. It's
supposed to
actually
stay there.
difficult to remove each anchor.
Mhm.
Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those.
Or someone had to do it
points,
manually.
Or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them
Probably not
with
an animal
either
that did
they
it
failed
either.
to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it. Or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what?
Strange,
it
but it's
can't
private
be
property.
Some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider.
Dad,
So
can
they
you
built
throw
their
me
tent,
your lighter
built a fire,
off the
and sat for a little
balcony?
while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly, and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there. And eventually, Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up.
Oh, he heard the
"What's
same
going
thing,
on?"
didn't
His
he?
dad goes, and he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and
That's not
carefully
good.
explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier. And Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them. It's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of the clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again. And it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on the zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision,
I'm not going
whatever this
outside.
thing is turns around and runs back into the woods. And it's just quiet. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left, just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened?
I would not be able to go to
Eben and
sleep.
his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet. Sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there.
He's got a wild clown in his hunting area.
Just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there.
So either it's a ghost of a clown, a spirit of a clown, a ghost of a clown, or a weird, or something, because it maybe that just one thing scared away all the animals and anything that lived there, or whoever was in there has been in there since it's been before it was private property. It's not great either. Bell's Canyon.
In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington State. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him.
There was a human.
A man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent.
I wouldn't know what to do.
This man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this,
I wouldn't
and so
either.
he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest, looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington State. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm gonna look out and I'm gonna see his
Maybe he just likes
flashlight
kicking
somewhere. I'm gonna
fire
see his
ashes.
campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby and he's looking around.
Why would he go to
in
your
total darkness.
campsite if
He's
that was
looking
the
at all the
case?
trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one.
Nothing.
There's no fire, there's no flashlight.
Just trees that you
nothing.
cannot
So eventually
see
Matt
or
goes back
barely
inside
see.
of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason, and then
Other than
vanished into
kicking
the forest
fire
without even
ashes.
turning on a flashlight. And so after a very
Yeah,
restless
he
night,
ran
finally the sun
blindly,
came up
basically.
again, and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare, because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and you know, stranger.
He ran pretty far he ran pretty well, being in the dark forest with no light. He ran pretty well without hitting a tree at all. I'd say that if he was intoxicated. I don't know about that.
Things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about.
There is
He packed
something
up
to
his
worry about.
campsite, and he began hiking into the forest.
Bad
Matt
idea.
didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next
I'll say right now, that looks like an animal on its hind legs. That looks like an animal on its hind legs.
He began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him.
It's the person
again.
Sure
it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off.
If it happened twice, honestly, if it happened the first time, I am moving myself to face that area 24/7. I'm not gonna turn my back on something I don't know that if it's there or not, especially in the woods.
There's something behind him that's moving around.
And after the fact that I saw a man kicking my fire ashes last night,
so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just
not
says,
intoxicated.
I don't know where Bell's
I know that.
is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes
I want to see him.
The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost. And they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon. And they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light.
Are you allergic to light or something? Come on, you should be glad I'm shining light on you. You should be glad. Because you're in the darkness behind a tree. You should be glad I'm shining light on you.
But now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes,
and
Matt
15 miles at that,
absolutely terrified. And this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again.
Do you know where Bell's Canyon is?
Except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And
what?
When he came through asking the same question,
he's using cheats.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him.
I see him, I go, oh jeez.
He only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's going to fall, get hurt, he's going to get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away. And so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's gonna pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. When the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles,
and
so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out
He
again.
really wanted those fire ashes.
Clearing in the trees,
and Bell's Canyon.
And he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere...
He's pretty good at following people. Be able to follow him that far, that easily.
In the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun
was
setting,
invisible.
he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so Matt
go get a good night's sleep to get all your stamina back.
He grabbed his knife and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone.
Maybe he found Bell's Canyon.
He's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then, as he's laying there, from somewhere out in the woods,
Know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot, he got to a nearby hotel,
and I'm sleeping.
Got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime.
As soon as I get to that hotel, I am jumping on the bed and taking a night. I'm gonna sleep for the entire day.
He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington State who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Do you think he found Bell's Canyon?
Wait, don't go anywhere. We actually have a bonus story for you. This final story has quickly become one of the classics on this channel. It's a story about a forest in Connecticut that is actually illegal to enter, basically because of maybe paranormal activity out there, we don't know, but it is actually illegal to go into this forest. There's a whole...
It's crazy. Animals are breaking the laws left and right.
Crazy story around it. I actually told the story on a live stream recently about Dudleytown, and so we went ahead and took that footage, we edited it, made it really pretty, and now you get to watch it in case you didn't see it live. Enjoy.
Yay! Ghost Town. You know I love ghosts.
In the summer of 1906, there was this couple, Dr. William Clark and his wife Harriet, and they were up in northwestern Connecticut, and they're driving along this winding country road in a place called Litchfield County. And as they're driving along, it's so scenic and beautiful with rolling hills and green everywhere. And what they were doing is they were looking for a location in this area that could serve as a location for their second home. So Dr. Clark was an oncologist, and they lived back in New York City, where he and his wife lived kind of a fabulous life. You know, he was super successful. He was not only an oncologist, he was a big-time professor as well. So they lived this amazing life in New York, but, you know, their lives were really hectic.
This is old.
New York City is a hectic place. But, you know, their lives, social people, always going out and going to functions and this and that. And so they had some extra money, and they wanted to, you know, buy or build a second home that would kind of serve as their retreat away from the city.
That's
and
a good idea, I guess maybe.
Looking all around the country, they found Litchfield County was kind of like the opposite of New York City. I mean, very few people were living there at the time, and again, it's this beautiful scenic place. And so it just seemed kind of like the perfect spot.
There's benefits and downsides of places with no people around, as you could definitely tell in many of these stories. It's not the greatest. Not the greatest at all.
So again, Dr. Clark and Harriet, they're just driving along, beautiful day, and they eventually, in Litchfield County, they eventually reach this beautiful red wood-covered bridge, and they go over it, and when they get to the other side, their field of view opened up because there weren't as many trees right on the other side of this bridge, and they suddenly had this view up and to the right, maybe, you know, half a mile away or something, of this weirdly shaded forest. Now you got to remember that basically everywhere they're looking, there's trees everywhere. I mean, it's very densely forested everywhere, but there was just this one kind of rise, like a pretty big hill, a prominent hill, that was really dark, like totally shaded. And it was because there was two mountains or two hills on either side of it, almost creating like a valley. And so it just looked like, wow, that's a very shaded forest. And as you'll see, it's actually called the Dark Entry Forest, in part because of how shaded it is.
Of course it is.
And so they've just come out of this bridge, and they're seeing this area up on this hill. There's no buildings, nothing. It's just trees. And there was just something immediately about it that really stood out to
I need to build a house there.
And they noticed that the road they were on, there appeared to be like an access road that kind of splintered off the road they were on, that appeared to go up into that forest, the Dark Entry Forest. And so they look at each other and they're like, hey, let's go up there. Maybe that's the place where we can find our spot for our second home. And so Dr. Clark pulls off the main road, goes on the access road, and he begins making his way up towards this kind of darkened forest area. And really quickly, the road itself was very overgrown. You know, at first it seemed like it was relatively well maintained, but the farther up they went towards this dark forest, the rougher it got, to the point where Dr. Clark couldn't even drive on it. There was too many potholes and everything. So they end up pulling the car over and parking. And at this point, they're actually in a bit of a clearing, and they can actually see up ahead of them where they parked. It looks almost like an entry point to the forest. The tree line is right in front of them, and there's kind of like a gap in the trees where this rugged road kind of continues into the forest, and they continue walking on foot towards the entry of this forest. Again, it's beautiful, scenic, very sunny, beautiful day. They're super excited, and they walk into the shade of the forest. And right away, it's like all the sunlight basically vanishes, but not in a spooky way, kind of like they lowered the brightness slightly, and it's very quiet. And you know, the canopy in Dark Entry Forest is known for being really, really thick, and so not much light was pushing through, but it created almost like, it was like they were walking into a bubble. You know, it's just pure, unadulterated silence and peace. And as they're walking on this road, which quickly becomes mostly like a little path, it doesn't even look like a road at some point. It's just kind of like grass that's been pushed down. Clearly, not many people or anything is coming into this forest, at least not from this direction. And as they're walking along, they're looking around and they're like, this place is so beautiful. I mean, it was already beautiful, but this is especially beautiful. Like, they walked maybe a couple hundred feet into the forest, and off to their right is this apple orchard, untouched. No one's taking these apples. It's just like a wild apple orchard, and there's deer that are just eating the apples off the tree, and they're looking over at Dr. Clark and his wife, and they're completely unafraid. They don't see people, so this is not terrifying for them. Deer just eating their apples, and then, you know, on the other side of the road, there's these huge, you know, fields.
Deer's like, there's a weird guy staring at me over there. I don't know who he is, but he's kind of in my personal space.
Full of flowers that are, again, trees are everywhere, but there's all these flowers at the bases of the trees, you know, lilies and roses and yellow bitter tansies, or I think that's what they're called. So all these beautiful flowers. And then at some point, as they walked a little bit farther into this dark entry forest, the sunlight that was poking through, it was hitting the ground in such a way that it was actually sparkling, because this forest was actually on a hillside, and there was this mineral called mica. If you're familiar, it's like this little translucent, it almost looks like kind of clouded glass. That's actually a mineral that comes from the ground. And when the sunlight hits it, it kind of looks like it sparkles. And so they're looking around at these wild animals that are unafraid of them, and flowers, and there's, you know, babbling brooks and streams. I mean, it's like out of a Disney movie. This is like a perfect place. And so by the time the couple came out of Dark Entry Forest, this is only, you know, like they walked around for maybe an hour or so. By the time they were coming out, they were completely sold that was going to be where they went ahead and bought their land to
I wouldn't blame it. It does sound pretty nice.
And so they go back to New York City, and they put in the paperwork to buy the land, and they buy 1,000 acres in this forest, which is ridiculous to imagine just casually buying 1,000 acres anywhere. But they did. They bought their 1,000 acres. And as soon as they had it, as soon as it was finalized, Dr. Clark began calling around to all these builders, local builders in Connecticut, that could help him build his home. And he had no intention of building some humongous home. They bought a huge amount of land, but they only wanted to build a small cabin. But despite the job being relatively simple, and despite Dr. Clark offering quite a bit of money to anybody who was willing to go out there and build this for him, none of the builders would do it. They never really gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they would not go into Dark Entry Forest, but universally, you know, no one would do it. And so, you know, Dr. Clark, he definitely was discouraged by that, but he just kind of chalked it up to, you know, okay, so obviously it's kind of an isolated place. It's hard to get into Dark Entry Forest, and where they had bought this land, it was pretty far into the forest. And so he just decided, okay, it just might not be worth it for them. It's logistically kind of a nightmare. They don't want to do it. And so Dr. Clark is undeterred, and he decides he will just build the house himself. Dr. Clark, he grew up on a farm in New Jersey. He was a very handy guy. He had built buildings before, so this was something he could do.
Yeah, sounds doable.
And so over the next
several
months, every weekend, Dr. Clark would make his way on his own to Dark Entry Forest, and it also was full of owls that were hooting all the time. So there's like this audio side of being in this forest, which is really intense. Like there's owls hooting constantly. And actually Dr. Clark and Harriet thought it was really cute that these owls, it seemed like they were almost personally greeting them as they came into the forest. And so Dr. Clark, every weekend for several months, he would go into Dark Entry Forest and be greeted by the owls, and he would go to the land where the 1,000-acre land, and actually he had identified this one kind of flat spot in the 1,000 acres that was good for building a home. And so the first thing he did over these several weekends he was out there is he just cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees, just kind of clearing out that flat area, and then he chopped up the trees he cut down into lumber, and he used that to build a rustic, simple 2-story cabin. And then after this cabin was built, kind of up on this hill, there happened to be another hill not too far away from the cabin where there was a freshwater spring right at the top. And so, you know, Dr. Clark, he went up and laid piping from the freshwater spring down to his cabin, so they had fresh water.
Man, that area is so convenient to build a cabin, to be able to live. You could probably live by yourself without going to the city to get supplies, and you could probably have a decent life.
In the cabin, and then down the hill from where the cabin was constructed was a small brook. And Dr. Clark, he found himself always going down and just staring into this beautiful brook because there were all these trout, because nobody fished out here. This is like an abandoned place, basically. There's all these trout just swimming around unencumbered, just leaping out of the water, if they even do that. I don't know if trout do that. I think they do. And so he ended up actually building a swimming pool right next to the brook, specifically so he could sit in the swimming pool
and watch the fish,
the trout. And so by Thanksgiving of that year, so 1906, by Thanksgiving, the property was done.
This is over 100 years ago. 118 years ago, I'd say.
Everything was done, and so
it's 2024 right now. So 1906 to 2024 minus 1906. I'm pretty sure is 118.
That holiday season, Dr. Clark and Harriet and their whole family would come out, and they would spend the holidays, sitting in their pool, watching the trout, and just having a wonderful time. And really, for many years, every summer and every major holiday, the Clark family would come out to their beautiful dark entry cabin and they would stay there. And it was really perfect. That is,
Sounds
until
like a good life.
1918. In 1918, in the summer, Dr. Clark
12
and
years
Harriet
later?
were at their cabin, and they were having a nice
Paranormal stuff
time
now.
when Dr. Clark got word that he was actually being called back to New York City for an emergency. Remember, he's an oncologist, so these things happen, and he was called back.
Oh, okay. I see.
And for whatever reason, Harriet, who normally likely would have joined him and just gone back to New York with him, she decided to stay. I mean, they've been coming here for years by this point, so she probably felt somewhat comfortable, although admittedly she was very unhappy about this. She didn't want to be there alone, but again, she decides to stay. But she tells Dr. Clark, because she didn't know how long he would actually be in New York. And
Better
he
get
didn't
back
know
here
either,
fast.
but she said, "You got to promise me you'll be back here as soon as you possibly can."
Yep.
And Dr. Clark would tell her that, I'll do my best. I should be back here in maybe, a couple of days from now. And I promise you I will come home as soon as I possibly can. And so Dr. Clark packs up his things, and he and his wife, they leave their cabin. They, walk their way down the trail, listening to the owls and looking at the mica sparkling on the ground. And they leave the forest, and they make their way to the nearby train station, which actually was not that far away from the entry to the forest. And Harriet dropped off her husband, and she watched, as he boarded and it began taking off, and he disappeared to go to New York. And Dr. Clark, as he's vanishing, traveling on this train, he's thinking to himself, okay, I'll be in New York just for a couple of days. I'll be home. I'll be back in no time. Little did he know, over the course of time he was going to be in New York,
His wife's having a
wife
terrible
would endure
time.
something that is just truly horrifying.
Yep.
So, before I explain
Let's
to
see
you what
what this
happened
is.
after Dr. Clark left, you need to understand some history about this forest.
Oh, this is gonna have some
History
terrible
that Dr.
history.
Clark and Harriet did not look into
Yeah,
before
probably
deciding
didn't know
to
if they're
purchase
gonna-
these 1,000
yeah.
acres. Because had they done the research into this area, they likely would not have bought the land.
So is there a lot of deaths
So
or something?
there actually
Or
used to be a
mysterious
town
disappearance?
that was
Oh.
settled in the Dark Entry Forest. It was called Dudleytown. And it was settled in the 1740s. And at first it was just
Oh,
a
200
couple of
years ago,
families
say?
just getting by.
160
but
years
pretty
ago?
quickly it
From
grew to about 30 families and
1906, I'd
several
say.
structures and houses and the whole 9 yards. Like, it's a small community inside of this beautiful forest. And things were great, for a small town in the 1700s. Things were stable. But starting at the end
Probably an amazing place to live in the 1700s. If you're away from major amounts of people with all the stuff that you need to survive in the wilderness.
of the 1700s, like in the 1790s up till about the 1800s, things
20,
started to go really, really badly in Dudleytown.
40 to 50
And in
years.
fact, because of how badly it went, it earned this. The conclusion was that Dudleytown had to be cursed, and that lore had stuck around, which is actually why those builders refused to do the work for Dr. Clark.
They already
They
knew
believed
it.
It was a cursed place. So this is what led to it being believed to be cursed, and I'll tell you, it's pretty creepy. So it started with the Carter family. So the Carter family was a big family inside of Dudleytown, and it was in 1790, 1792. There was this cholera epidemic that broke out in this small town, and 6
It's probably
members
not
of the
good.
Carter family died really suddenly from cholera. And the remaining members of the Carter family, which was significant, I think there was a dozen people still left, might have been a few less than that, but a pretty good chunk of people, they were so grief-stricken from the loss that they decided to just literally abandon their houses in Dudleytown and go back to New York City, where they happened to be from as well, same as Dr. Clark. But as soon as they got to New York, they were massacred by natives that lived in the area, and the only people that survived.
So it wasn't New York. I'm guessing it wasn't really called New York City at the time. I'm guessing it was probably called something else. Still had natives in it.
This massacre were 3
Or New
children,
York.
and the 3 children were kidnapped and never seen again.
Oh, that's not
And
good.
so that was the start of bad things happening to people in Dudleytown. The next thing that happened is there was a guy named Hollister. We don't know his last name, but he either fell off a roof or he was pushed. We don't really know, but either way he died. But he died on or near another person's home whose name was Tanner. Okay, so Hollister dies, and he dies on or near Tanner's home. And after Hollister died, which again it was shrouded in mystery, Tanner, the owner of the home where this guy died,
he began talking obsessively, and it's documented, obsessively, about strange creatures lurking around the tree line inside of Dark Entry Forest, right around Dudleytown, every night. That's all he saw. So guy dies, and all of a sudden Tanner is noticing all these strange creatures. And he's telling everybody in town that there's something going on here. Nobody believed him. And so slowly, Tanner, every night, he would see whatever he was seeing, and it drove him insane, completely insane, to the point where he couldn't even function, and his daughter had to take care of him until he
couldn't even
passed
function
away.
anymore because of that?
And as Tanner was losing his mind, his next door neighbor, whose name was Abel, began to talk as well about these creatures that were coming to the edge of the tree line surrounding Dudleytown most nights. And just like Tanner, Abel as well slowly lost his mind over these creatures because nobody believed him. And then all the way up until like just past the 1800s, so many people just randomly died in Dudleytown. Some from
That's
disease
weird.
for sure, but others they'd just be found dead.
Yeah.
And then many
like
people.
The other guy without the last name. He was either like pushed. I think that's what he said. Pushed.
As well began
Died.
citing these strange creatures that were lurking all around.
It's the
By
ghosts of
1900,
the victims.
the only family that was still alive in Dudleytown was this family called the Brophies. And it was a fairly big family, and the mother, she suddenly died of cholera. The two sons, they were accused of theft in another town and then fled and vanished. And so literally it's down to John Brophy, the actual last person who's living in Dudleytown.
Last person.
And one night, he
died?
Apparently he didn't know why, but his cabin burned to the ground.
What?
After his cabin, or while his cabin was burning, people were called out. They saw the smoke. They came out
Did
to
he
put out
see
this
like
fire.
things in the woods
And
this
the last
time?
anyone saw of John, who's lost his whole family, he's lost everything, is he just turned and walked deeper into the forest and was never seen
So he
again.
just walked in the
And no one could
forest.
find him. That was it. And that was the last person who lived in Dudleytown, and that marked the moment
There's some strange
that
things going on
Dudleytown
in this
went from,
forest.
still being occupied to being a literal ghost town. And you can actually look up the newspaper article.
And instead of ghost town, like I would think, where it's just people left the town, everyone died or left because they were charged, or they were somewhat charged with like criminal things. I don't know if they were or not. It's mysterious.
That documented the moment when Dudleytown became a ghost town. No one lives there. A few years later is when Dr. Clark and Harriet were taking their stroll through Litchfield County, and
Oh, it wasn't even that long ago either. It was only like a few years. It wasn't even that long.
up into Dark Entry Forest
It ended at like the
and saying,
1900s.
wow, this is
And they
the
got
place
there in
for us.
1906.
And they saw the ruins of Dudleytown. They walked
they did?
past the crumbling foundations of these old homes, and there was all these remnants of this town that was still there, but much the way they viewed the owls as being...
I mean, if I saw ruins in an area so great like that, I'd probably think of more why they abandoned such a place in the first place. Because something must have happened.
kind of charming. They also viewed this rundown old town that was gone as kind of cute, and it made them want to stay there more. So they were aware of the town, but didn't do the research. Apparently Dudleytown was cursed, and that is where they bought their land.
Now let's dive it down.
So, fast forward to 1918. So Dr. Clark, he's left for this emergency trip to New York, and it would turn out he was only needed in New York for 36 hours. It was, as short as he could have
Day and a
expected
half.
it to be. So less than 2 days later, keeping his word to his wife, he's back on a train, and he's heading back to that stop where Harriet had dropped him off near the Dark Entry Forest. And although this
He's
was
gonna come
rare
home behind
that,
his wife,
Dr.
terrified,
Clark would leave his
wanting to
wife
get out of that
in
place
the
as soon as
cabin,
possible.
he expected her to be waiting for him at the train station.
Probably in a
They
room.
didn't have an exact time that he was going to be there because it wasn't not entirely planned. But he had said, I'll be here in like 1 or 2 days max. And so he just kind of expected his wife to check the schedule and be at the train platform. But as he's pulling into the station, he sees his wife is not there. Now, this was not some huge cause for concern, but it was enough of a red flag that as, he's pulling into the station, Dr. Clark is thinking
Something
something
could have
feels
happened.
off. And so he ends up going from the train station, and he actually walked the rest of the way. He didn't take a car or anything. He walked to that access road and made his way up to the entry of Dark Entry Forest. And as soon as he walked into the forest, so daylight out here, he steps into the canopy and it's dark again. And remember, it used to feel so welcoming and wonderful going into that forest, so peaceful. But now it has a different feel. He steps into the forest and suddenly it feels threatening. It feels ominous.
Oh.
And the owls that are hooting the whole time
They're
he
not
steps
hooting
in,
anyone?
it didn't feel like they were greeting him. It felt like
Oh.
they were telling him to leave. But he had to find his wife, and he's thinking she's up at the cabin. That's where we need to go. And so he begins kind of jogging, fast walking. He's getting a little nervous through the forest, and as he's moving through, the sounds of these owls are getting louder and louder and louder and more threatening, until finally, when he gets to the clearing, when he can actually look up and see where he built his cabin up on this hill, it's like a cacophony of noise. It's just constant hooting, almost like it doesn't even sound like hooting. It's just a loud sound that's constant. And so Dr. Clark is starting to panic, but he gets even more panicked when he looks up at the cabin. He doesn't see his wife, but he sees the front door to this cabin is slightly ajar. And so Dr. Clark, he runs the rest of the way up the hill, owls hooting the whole time. He gets to the door, and he's terrified. He knows there's something wrong here, but he gets the courage. He opens up the front door, and the second he steps into this home, which he has loved and spent years and years in with his family, he steps in and everything is different.
Yep.
Instead of it being peaceful, he now feels this almost high-pitched sound, like inside of his head for a second, and he's confused. And then he hears what sounds like maniacal laughter coming from the second floor. He doesn't see anybody on the first floor. He thinks it's his wife, and so he charges upstairs.
Is it not his wife?
Gets to the landing, and he sees the door to his bedroom, where he would expect his wife to be, is slightly open, and he can hear this laughter coming from inside of this room, this maniacal, crazy, loud, high-pitched laughter. And he's totally panicked. He goes to the door, and he opens it up, and there, in the back corner of the bedroom, is his wife.
Laughing?
In the fetal position, and her mouth has been opened as wide as it can go.
Whoa.
And the laughter that he's hearing is coming out of her body, but her jaw isn't moving. Her chest is heaving, and this maniacal laughter is just coming out of her.
So she's just laughing without laughing out of her mouth?
And so Dr. Clark, he was so terrified at what he was seeing and all the hooting and all this craziness going on that he just turned and ran away. We don't know what happened to Harriet Clark over those 36 hours that her husband was gone, but something happened to her. And when she was taken away from this cabin, the only thing she would say is the strange creatures kept coming back. I kept seeing strange creatures. Same thing that all the people in Dudleytown had said that caused them to flee the town. And so we don't know exactly what became of Harriet. There is one account that says she was forever, she went to a mental hospital and stayed there until she passed. Another account says she went back to New York with Dr. Clark, where she took her life. But either way, the final thing was she claimed to have seen the strange creatures and lost her mind as well. Following this, following the story, Dark Country Forest really took on this unbelievable legend. I mean, people knew about this story. They knew about the legend of the 1700s and 1800s, but this felt recent. I mean, this was a documented case.
That is recent.
Of his life. And so it spawned a lot of people going into Dark Country Forest to see what's out there. And lots of people who go into that forest before it became illegal reported feeling phantom hands slapping them on the back and feeling really intense pockets of cold air. And actually, the very famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, in the 1970s, they went out and ran this special series about what happened in the Dark Country Forest. And they came out and said, absolutely, that forest is demonically possessed.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's...
I'm going to make a theory about this area. Let's see. What am I thinking? What was I thinking just a minute ago? I don't remember what I was thinking just a minute ago. I don't remember what I was thinking. But since we have finished these 5 bingeable scary stories all about the forest, because forests are terrifying. If you don't know that before, you know it now. So, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications so you guys never miss another video. And I also have a new video coming out soon. You'll see what it is. It's something related to Five Nights at Freddy's. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.